the realness of reality. I don't know how to say this, but think of the video of people videoing the roof on fire there was that awful fire, I think on New Year's Eve somewhere in maybe Switzerland or something.
Mm.
And you had all these people watching it, taking a video of it. Their life is literally in danger, and it the wires were not connecting, and it's because I think we're like fundamentally detached from just like physics and like
Yeah.
engagement with reality. And I think a huge part of that is screen time and internet use with young people.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast. I'm Ryan Rogers, and joining me for the 9th time, I believe, is licensed therapist Katie Kernodle. So welcome, Katie.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So I think this makes you tied with Jonathan for first place in number of appearances on this podcast. Would you like to talk any trash?
Well, I feel like I've been unjustly barred from boys' night and therefore deserve 2 appearance counts for every time that I'm on. So technically I'm twice as far ahead as Jonathan.
I think Jonathan has been padding his stats with these men's mental health nights where you're not invited.
Yeah, so patriarchy.
It's definitely the patriarchy, 100%. So it was interesting. A few times ago that you were on here, I asked, what are we not talking about enough? And you said the woke right. And this has kind of been on my mind a lot lately. And I'm wondering, like, what are you seeing generally when it comes to the woke right? And I guess, like, how would you define it?
Yeah, so well, in terms of what I'm seeing, I think there's, been a general subversion or at least an attempt at subverting the right, particularly as like Trump won and there's a huge amount of momentum and potentially power. And there's also an opportunity to kind of screw up that momentum and therefore using what's the word I'm looking for? Like where you uh like steal victory from the jaws of defeat. What is that
Steal
phrase?
defeat
Do you
from
know?
the jaws of victory.
Yes, there we go. Yeah. So I feel like that's kind of what's happening here in terms of just like strategically trying to undermine, the success of the Trump administration and this broad kind of coalition. In terms of like what is the woke right, and obviously, I mean, James Lindsay has talked about this extensively, and I'll defer to everything that he said, and if anything that I say contradicts that, just defer to him. But from everything that he said and that I've read, there are 2 primary elements that I think are worth understanding. So first is the belief that reality, it's like the postmodern, I guess you could say, political principle, like that reality is produced and fundamentally contoured by power. And so it's this extreme obsession with power that we are literally created by, that reality is literally created by power, which I think brings about this sense of alienation and entitlement. So, that feeling of being flung in the Heideggerian sense into unjust circumstances and identifying the them, if you want to use like a Gnostic language, like the demiurge, basically the socio-Gnostic demiurge, the them who have alienated you and your in-group from your, who you really are and your rightful inheritance. So on the right, we see this with, you'll see sometimes like videos or like agitprop basically showing like what things used to be. California used to be this like magical place, and conveniently it's all white people. And so it's basically, or like you see this on all of the like the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, that social media account, perfect example, I think, of woke right, where it's always, that you've been alienated from your rightful inheritance by immigrants and globalists and this, and that. And that's why you have to work at Panda Express. And that's why you don't have a 6-figure job right out the gate. It's that kind of thing. And so first is the ontology, that reality is produced and fundamentally constructed by power. And the second is the epistemological part of this. And as far as I understand, this is probably more important, which is that critical constructivist epistemology, that because reality is fundamentally constructed by power dynamics, therefore there's no such thing as objective truth and universal truth. It's that rejection of Enlightenment modernism. And that brings about that preference for so-called marginalized knowledges, and the belief that knowledge and therefore institutions cannot be neutral. And as such, we should take power and exert our values and our beliefs and that kind of thing.
I'm interested. The epistemology piece is so interesting because I think you and I have both fleshed this out quite a bit on the woke postmodern left. Um, but I think an interesting part is kind of what you were talking about, like this revisionist history, and how I mean, one thing that I've tried to get off social media as much as I can. It's it's hard, but I would keep seeing like remember what they took from you, and it'll be like something quaint small town America or like a high school football player with his cheerleader girlfriend. And it's like, there's like all these things that's like, you could have had this life with a hot wife if only it wasn't for like the woke or immigrants or something, or the Jews. Like, I'm not sure 100% like what narrative they're trying to spin, but they're like revising history in such a way that like it could have been like this idyllic, like Eden paradise if it weren't for XYZ.
Yeah, it's that and I always get where you put the V wrong, but it's
Yeah.
return with a V.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's that kind of thing. And it's a very like esoteric and, ultimately I think like Marxian impulse is that, that you've been alienated from your Garden of Eden and, it's them usually like for, a lot of left wing it's the straight white whatever that kind of thing. For the right it's, the Jews, the immigrants, this, and that, and they're the ones that have stolen from you. So it's like frankly just an entitlement complex. Is ultimately what it boils down to. It's feeling entitled to have everything handed to you and everything being perfect simply because you exist and you are a part of this particular identity class.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I want to touch on the Marxism piece because this is such a fascinating thing to me because on the surface, a lot of these people are regularly denouncing Marxism and saying how terrible Marxist infiltration in schools is and all this kind of stuff. But I won't name names, but I've had people on this podcast who will say like, we have to fight Marxism, and the next breath tell me about labor theory of value and like just reciting kind of Marxist cliches, but with like a thin right-wing veneer. Like, you see that?
Yeah, it's it makes me think of the James writing as quote Marcus Carlson getting into the American Reformer with the hoax paper, which is
Yeah.
that yeah, it's hilarious. But yeah, it's that like fundamentally, I mean, I think about things in a very particular way when it comes to Marxism, so it's like maybe a little bit different than like this like focus on economic theory. I pull a lot from Eric Voegelin and this idea that it's fundamentally like a Gnostic spiritual revolt, which I think fits and makes sense, and also why I think there are like existential parallels between these different manifestations, even if they're not explicitly Marxist. We also know, for example, that the critical theorists were critiquing Marx, that like part of the dialectical process is critique. So they can do the dialectic on the dialectic. So I would never use like critique of Marxism as an example of why somebody or something is not Marxist, because it's a little bit more complicated than that. But I'm thinking, for example, of Stalin, like one of Stalin's rare pieces of theory. I think it's from 1913, and it's called Marxism and the National Question, I believe. I'd have to double check that, but basically, it's using like national sentiment and like national revolutionary fervor as a means toward international socialism. So it's using that as basically like a springboard towards this international socialism. So I think it's kind of like built into the whole framework and like sort of this like strategic way of doing things that Marxists operate in. So I think we're seeing that. And then I think also, and I'm wondering if if you've not spent a lot of time on social media, you might not notice as much. But like agitprop, like what you're seeing, what you described with those, what they stole from you, that's agitprop. Using struggle and malicious lies and subversion, and for like maybe a right-wing Leninist, like I'm thinking, for example, Steve Bannon, I think he's even explicitly called himself a Leninist, using like a disciplined vanguard to lead the unenlightened masses to the revolution, accelerating crises and contradictions, like all of those different kinds of things we see in this sort of like woke right demographic, and I think it's indicative both, like in terms of theory, but also like existentially or spiritually, that it's on the same wavelength, if that makes sense.
It does. I think it's important that like people like us talk about this kind of thing because the critique coming from the left is so shallow and missing the mark. I'll hear him say stuff like, "Oh yeah, this is just like Milton Friedman." It's just like you're not even close. And like Steve Bannon is such an interesting one where there's so much to tap into because he's got this kind of quasi-Marxism tool belt pointed in a right-wing direction. I've heard that Bannon carries a copy of the Bhagavad Gita with him everywhere he goes. Like, there's just so many, just like, how does all this stuff fit together? I don't know.
I mean, my temptation is to say, like, ultimately esotericism, and I think this is probably relevant for you as a Christian because I think it's very, like, frankly, evil to see so much of the woke right basically cosplaying and using the veneer of Christianity when I think it's, like, fundamentally to its core anti-Christian, and even without the theoretical part of, like going back to Hegel and like all of that kind of stuff, like Hegel as a hermeticist, like that very niche stuff. I think you can just see it in the fruits and how they treat other people and some of the malicious and frankly evil ways that they operate.
Interesting. I think we should get into the Christian nationalism piece. Some of this stuff is so hard to talk about because it's hard to define your terms in ways that are acceptable to people. And I've heard people say, well, I'm a Christian and I support, like fair trade or whatever. I'm a nationalist. So like, what's wrong with that? And it's like hard to get them to understand, like, this is like a complete inversion of Christianity in so many ways. What can you tell me about Christian nationalism that's anti-Christian, I guess?
Yeah, well, and I think you bring up an important thing about in terms of tactics, like the use of strategic ambiguity. They're using language that you specifically assume is okay. So I'm not like super up to date on Christian nationalism. A good source for this is Michael O'Fallon. As far as I understand, he's a Southern Baptist, and he's like very knowledgeable, specifically on like not only the theological but also just the pragmatic goings on of the church. But it's like I know that it depends based on different denominations and things like that. But as a general rule, in terms of like what we might consider to be broad Orthodox Christianity, it's you are not seeking to, basically do works to bring about, the second coming of Christ and like a perfected society like that. I would not consider that to be Orthodox Christianity. I think that, you would consider it to be something that God does. And it's not, for us to do these works to participate in the revolution and therefore gain our salvation. Like that, I think that's a really important distinction. I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase "don't immanentize the eschaton." Is that
I've heard you
familiar to
say
you?
it. I've heard you
Okay.
say it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's from Eric Voegelin, who I'm very very much influenced by Eric Voegelin, but I think it was William F. Buckley that kind of turned it into a big phrase. But it basically means like don't try to bring the perfected heaven on earth. I think that's kind of one of like the essence of critical theory is using the ideal to criticize the real. And I think
Yeah.
it's very toxic, and it's fueled by that entitlement complex. And so I think that's like fundamentally anti-Christian. Like I don't the beauty and the importance, I think, of Christianity as a foundation to this country, I think spiritually and culturally, is that it avoids that entitlement complex. It mitigates against that. It's about gratitude, peace, patience, those kinds of like fruits of the spirit, if you will, that I think are like fundamentally the opposite of what we see with like some of the like literally demonic activity of the woke right, just like malicious stuff.
Yeah, it is. And it's like, it's so tough to pin down because I mean, I was thinking the other day about how like if you look at Matthew chapter 4, when the devil is tempting Jesus, he's using scripture but twisting it, right? And I think so much of this is like, well, I'm trying to implement this perfect heaven on earth. I'm trying to implement a utopian society, which obviously God would like. And so anybody who disagrees with me is essentially like fair game for unlimited aggression.
Yeah, well, and like Matthew 4, I think is so important in this context because there's that temptation of power. that all of this can be
Yes,
yours.
yes.
Like that. And that I think is the core like spiritual deformation that's underlying woke is, basically coveting power. So I think that's really important. I'm sorry, but can you clarify for me what the question was?
I don't know if I had a coherent question.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just trying to. So I guess here's kind of a general direction that I want to go. And when I look at the woke left, it seems like trying to like have this umbrella of all like so-called marginalized groups. Um, and the big three would be kind of radical feminism, critical race theory, and kind of the queer theory, I guess. And the glue that holds them all. I mean, there's smaller ones like disability studies, fat studies, and various different, decolonial stuff. But the glue that holds it all together would be intersectionality. And kind of when I look at the woke right, like the mirror of that, I think Christian nationalism is like a huge piece of it. I think the white nationalist or white supremacist, whatever language you want to use, and then a lot of the red pill, like male grievance politics, I think those are your big three on the right. I don't know what the glue is that holds all that together. It doesn't seem to go together to me.
Yeah. That's interesting. I think, and like when you bring up the intersectionality, it makes me think that it's almost like like the polar, not the polar opposite, but like a mirror image
Mm,
of the intersectionality. We're like, yeah, reality is constructed by power and white men should be in charge. It's like the
yeah.
opposite of that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um,
It's like they're agreeing to the terms of woke, but instead of saying that's bad, they're saying it's good.
yeah, it's very interesting. I think like in terms of the different, I guess you could say like impulses or factions. I mean, I'm not sure what specifically unites them other than maybe like and I'm not even sure like the groypers would fall into this category, but maybe like a preference for, um, like blood and soil, national, um, like basically identity politics. And I guess that goes back to the intersectionality is that, that your male gender is extremely important in particular ways, that there's like a preference for marginalized knowledges that comes from being quote unquote oppressed by the longhouse, if we want to use like the
Mm.
male kind of thing.
What is the
Because that's one of,
longhouse?
so as far as I understand it, I guess like I'm not exactly sure what culture, it might be Scandinavian or something like that, where or indigenous, but these long houses of that houses were designed in a long way, and that's where the women would all be, and power is controlled by like women and kind of like female ways of doing things, maybe a little bit more indirect and like frankly catty, like that kind of thing. So I think that's where that comes from. But basically it just means rule by women. If you see sometimes like um, agitprop that's complaining about women having corporate jobs or women having like the,
Mm.
basically like fake jobs. And because that woman has some sort of corporate job and therefore is not at home, with children or
Ah.
whatever, then that's why our society is collapsing. And that's why we have all these immigrants. And that's why, again, I
Mm.
have to work at Panda Express and I don't have a six-figure job outside, immediately out of college. Like it's that kind of, it's that impulse. And like it makes me think too of on the topic of intersectionality, that how everything is constantly linked. It's heteronormativity is linked with um sexism, which is linked with racism, which is linked with that. It's like that kind of totalizing impulse that everything is related to one another and they all boil down to this fundamental principle.
That's wow. I mean, I think a lot of this kind of boils down to anti-meritocracy. Like, I think a lot of the hatred of Jews is Jews outcompeted a lot of people in cognitive work and have been successful in a lot of those, high cognitive horsepower realms. And it's not because there's some secret Jewish cabal. It's because like they studied harder, And I think it's the same thing with like women getting these like email jobs. It's because they did better in school. Like, and we could talk about why, is there a preference for women who are, better able to sit still in school? Like, there may be reasons for that, but ultimately, like, women outcompeted a lot of these men. And I think there's like some understandable nature to why some men like feel hurt by that. I think, I've talked to a number of men who like their wives are the breadwinner and that they have to do a lot of psychological work to like to deal with that. So I think there's understandable reasons why some of these men feel hurt. I just don't think destroying Western civilization is the answer.
Yeah, and I do think that's fair, that there are little kernels of truth that are kind of put into these things, that there are it's hard to get a home now. Home prices have skyrocketed. It's very difficult. A lot of times you do have to have two incomes. Oftentimes maybe like these quote unquote email jobs, that just the way that the economy is structured, they might be a little bit more profitable, and it might like incentivize having female breadwinners, like that kind of thing, that might, make people feel certain ways. But like it's like taking from that and then extrapolating out all of these things. It's like leaning into the worst impulses instead of working through and resisting them. Um, and I think like kind of related to that is, and like because we're talking about this gender thing, but I think there's like a very intense urge when people talk about the longhouse and um sort of like this new gender dynamic or that kind of thing, is like specifically a desire for a strong man. There's like some sort of weird, I'm not a psychoanalyst. I think one of your boys night guys is a psychoanalyst. Am
Yeah,
I understanding
yeah.
that? Yeah, you should
Dr.
ask him
Perrin.
about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But there is some sort of daddy issues, I want a strong man impulse embedded deep within there that somebody with, more like psychoanalytic training should flesh out.
I think some of it is also the inability to tolerate uncertainty. Like, I have to have exact answers for this, and there can be no like vagueness or ambiguity. Like, I think a lot of the postmodern inclination was too much vagueness when we do have certainty on some things. And kind of this woke right is like, no, I need to have exact answers, even if that's not really in the cards. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really important insight. It's that like swinging, so like break everything down and then like a desperate swing to total control. And I talk a lot about like that Gnostic impulse. I think the core of the Gnostic impulse is a desire for certainty, to know the beginning and the end. Um, that's why I think you'll see a lot of times they kind of play on that, where that this is happening and it's because of this complete conspiracy. You have a total picture of everything. You feel like you can predict and control and basically, and I think this is like, again, fundamentally anti-Christian, like seize power from God and therefore control your own circumstances, that you are not the potter, that you're the clay. And it's
Mm.
like kind of an inversion of that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Um, so we talked a little bit about this, but the white supremacy, white nationalism, blood and soil side of things is really interesting to me because, like, probably the face of, or one of the most popular white nationalists is Hispanic, Nick Fuentes. And you've got, I mean, like the coalitions are bizarre to me because you've got like a black white coalition hating Jews, and then like this white Hispanic coalition hating black people. And it's just like, it's a bizarre, configuration to me. What do you see there?
Yeah, well, on the Nick Fuentes stuff specifically, I see queer theory. Like I think that's kind of what's going on there. I think they're kind of like right wing, right-ish wing, like queer theory. But it's similar to like the inverse with like, say, like the black face of white supremacy, or like,
Mm.
that kind of thing. It's where the identity marker is not so much, and not always so much, race. It's like sometimes like race as a proxy, for like the right ideology.
Hmm. Say more about that. Race is a proxy for the right ideology.
Yeah, like, for example, like on the left, if you think of Thomas Sowell, like Thomas Sowell
Oh.
is he's racially black, but he's, like spiritually white, that kind of thing from their
Okay, yeah.
perspective. So, for somebody like and Nick Fuentes, I think, is a difficult example for me, just because I think like I don't really understand, like, I don't know if he's trolling. I think that there's like a particular, especially like Gen Z demographic, that's very, very, very queer and is like completely caught up in this internet ironic culture where you never really know if what they're saying is even real. They like do things to get a rise out of people, and it's like very weird and confusing. There's not a lot of it's hard to analyze it earnestly, basically. But I think it's that same kind of thing, is like the having the correct right wing nationalist or like National Socialist ideology is therefore more important, or like being on the right side of the revolution is more important than, like specifically these like demographic characteristics, even if the
Mm.
demographic characteristics are being used to facilitate the revolution.
Mm. Interesting. Yeah. I read a phenomenal book almost a decade ago now. It was called Kill All Normies by a Irish Marxist scholar named Angela Nagel. And it was so fascinating. It's about kind of all these like political subcultures on the internet. And one of the things she said is like, if you think this is like inspired by F.A. Hayek, like you're missing it. I love that because she's like so much of this, and I think a lot of the Trump MAGA thing, a lot of the woke rights stuff is inspired by like online trolling, like you were saying. And I think there's a lot of people who, maybe it comes out that Donald Trump says something factually inaccurate, and like people don't care. It's like he owned the libs. I've got my mug here that says "Place liberal tears here." It's like the factual accuracy of something is less important. Not even for, I think I mean, some people are thinking about revolution, but some people it's just like, I just want to LOL at the dumb other side. I just want to like troll, own the libs. Like that's such a huge motivating factor that I feel like doesn't get touched on enough.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think that it's that like weird like detachment. I like you see this a lot in Gen Z, and I think it's because they're online, and it sounds like that book is specifically about online subcultures. But there's a very specific phenomenon, and I sometimes hear this from people who have, I guess, Gen Z, or I think it's Gen Alpha that's maybe a little bit younger than Gen Z
Yeah.
now. But it's this like weird, cold detachment from reality. And I think that's been intentionally um brought about by just like this constant, like, there's like a little bit of truth in the sense that like there has been like a little like a power has been in the hands of postmodern Marxists for some time in a lot of contexts, like specifically education. And like in doing so, there's naturally going to be like a sense of reaction and almost like a tuning out, where like if everything is just kind of BS, it's normal or expected for, kids and young people to just kind of check out and become detached from the concept of like objective reality. I'm also thinking, for example, of just like this like very detached connection from like the real consequences of your actions. So, or just like the actual like real or the realness of reality. I don't know how to say this, but like think of the video of people videoing the roof on fire at that. There was that awful fire, I think on New Year's Eve somewhere in maybe Switzerland or something.
Mm.
And you had all these people watching it, taking a video of it. Their life is literally in danger, and it like was not, the wires were not connecting, and it's because I think we're like fundamentally detached from just like physics and like
Yeah.
engagement with reality. And I think a huge part of that is screen time and internet use with young people.
That's so. I was talking to somebody. I think it might have been on this podcast, but talking about how like in the Matrix, the movie The Matrix, people are stuck in this computer program and they're forced to be there and they don't know it. And then you look at like Ready Player One. I'm not sure if you've read or seen that, but it's a book where people are like using virtual reality. They're there pretty much like all their waking hours. It's like I know I'm in a computer program and I choose to be here rather than the real world. Like I'm fully aware this is a simulation. I'm not like unaware. It's just like I don't really care about reality. Like the reality is not as fun. It's kind of boring.
Hmm. Yeah, it's like I'm hearing that apathy is like,
Yeah.
and I think that's really important because it is. I think there's like a part of this that like relates, I think, to demoralization, not even just in the apathetic sense, but like apathetic to truth. That like it just
Mhm.
none of it even matters, and just like becoming very detached. Like that's kind of what I hear and what I see with a lot of young people. And that's why when I, in the past when I've said that one of the most important things that we need to be talking about is the woke right, because I'm like that's something that's happening with a lot of young people that I think is really difficult, um, not only to articulate but to address, because we need like male role models or role models in general. But like I think that the right wing stuff kind of leans towards targeting young men, but like getting practice in the real world with jobs, having role models at church, like having good parenting, all of those kinds of things I think are like absolutely critical to mitigate some of the just like endless detachment and apathy that we're seeing.
Mm. I want to talk. We talked a little bit about like the male resentment at female success in the workplace. What all do you know about the red pill and the manosphere and that? I think there's probably more legitimate and less legitimate sides of that coin. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, I mean that might be a question maybe for you. I don't know if you have more experience just like talking to people in that. As far as I understand, like I'm thinking of Andrew Tate, who again seems like heavily queer to me. So it's very
Mm.
difficult to like kind of take that at face value. Um, but there is, I think like they'll talk about things like you're gonna get quote, if you need to like edit this out, but like divorce raped. That's like a huge thing that they say. That women are all, bad and will cheat on you and only want you for your money and are like washed up and this and that. Like that, it's that kind of like rhetoric or urge, if that makes sense. That's as far as I understand it.
So, I see this a lot with younger men. I mean, like under 40 or so. And it's like their social media feed, their algorithm gets like tailored because they know this is upsetting. And so upsetting means I dwell longer on it, which means that's better for, profits essentially. Um, but it's like you were saying, like, why bother? And I think I talked a lot about Dr. Danny Stolakowski. We talk about female intersexual competition. I think a lot of this comes down to male intersexual competition. If I can get you to believe that all women are lying, manipulating, cheating, blah blah blah, you're going to give up, and that's more for me. I think that's like part of the reason, because a lot of these people like are not celibate. The people making the content, like they're out dating themselves, but it's I'm trying to pass this cynical nihilistic message on to you. Um, and I've seen a lot of people like it's like they know it's not true, but they're stuck. And I experienced this personally, like maybe a year or two ago on X. I started seeing my like these stories pop up on my news feed on X. It would be like the theme was always like women are bad, but it's like it's like a really emotional story. Like I married the woman who's the love of my life and I gave my heart to her and we had 3 kids, blah, blah, blah. It was amazing. And then I found out she'd been cheating on me the whole time. The kids belonged to the neighbor. And like, it's like a horror story of like cheating or like some kind of betrayal by a woman. And I was like, why does this keep popping up on my feed? It's because my eyes are dwelling on it. And so I started blocking, like anytime I saw something like that, I would block it. And I think it's like, it's almost like it's hard to avoid this type of content. And it's like, if you made a video or had a post about how, my relationship is happy and healthy, and I'm so glad that I started dating this woman. That's pretty boring. That's not going to get a lot of traction. But these horror stories, like that's what goes viral. And 2 podcasts I want to call out particularly are Whatever and Fresh and Fit. I don't know if you're familiar with those.
I think, well, I've definitely seen the Whatever. I think Fresh and Fit is that Myron
Yeah, Myron
Gaines guy.
Gaines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and then also like, because when you were talking and talking about like that horror story, I was thinking that a lot of times they tie this up with racist things too. So it's like, oh, your girl's going to leave you for, and they use like some
Oh.
racist general term like Tyrone, that kind of thing.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So, and like Myron Gaines, as far as I understand, has some pretty like explicitly anti-Semitic
Yeah.
tendencies. So that,
Yeah.
like I think a lot of the racism is tied up in that. And just kind of like circling back to, Marxism and, this communist revolutionary strategy, specifically targeting the family. That is a goal. And so, if you could use the right and the manosphere to do it, to get people to not have, healthy relationships. And there's also just, the psychological and lack of flourishing element in terms of like not having healthy relationships, harboring a significant amount of resentment and bitterness towards the opposite sex. Obviously all of that is toxic in a variety of different ways beyond just the family, but I do think it fundamentally relates to this communist revolutionary strategy, and a part of that, like a central part of that, is destroying the family.
That's so fascinating you brought it back to Marxism, because Marxism is, one of the fundamental core parts of it, like a redistribution of wealth. And I heard someone I think is so accurate. A lot of this like red pill resentment is kind of, in some sense, a demand for sexual redistribution. This concept of like, I'm never going to own the means of production, so I need the government to seize it and kind of give it to me. I'm not 6 feet tall and make 6 figures a year, blah, blah, blah. A woman will never choose me, so I need some kind of state intervention to kind of force a woman to kind of come to me.
Which is really, really creepy.
Yeah.
And it's that entitlement complex. Like, it's like, I swear to God, like, all of this every single time, it just boils down to being entitled, and just like demanding things that you have not earned. Because in order to have a healthy marriage or a relationship, there's work that has to be put in. There's things that you have to sacrifice and things that you have to do, things that you have to work on for yourself. And all of that, is not necessarily fun or easy. So it's like that desire to like just be, like playing video games all day and not getting a job and like doing all of these things that women find unattractive, but then still demanding that women find you attractive. And it's just not how reality works. So yeah, I think I had a second thought there and I got like put on a tangent. Can you remind me what the last thing was that you said?
Um, uh, like just like comparing like Marxism as like a redistribution of wealth with like the red pill, kind of a sexual redistribution.
Yeah, I think now I know what I was thinking. And I would have to double check. So, don't quote me specifically on this, but I'm fairly certain in at least one, it might have been specifically Engels. It might not have been Marx, but I think there's writing that specifically articulates like the ideal communist society as having wife sharing or women sharing. So basically women turned into, property to be redistributed. So those parallels I think are really important that you're picking up on.
Man, that is fascinating. That's so much of what this is, because they view, I mean, it is kind of, it's certainly a type of objectification of women, but it's like, in one sense, it views women as evil, and in another sense, it views women as like the most valuable commodity on planet Earth, and it's being hoarded and kept from them. I say it deliberately.
Yeah, I think you should definitely talk to that psychoanalyst guy about this, because I'm like the psychodynamic mind in me that is not like fully fleshed out, because obviously I'm a very new clinician. I'm seeing it in my mind that there's something worth fleshing out there. Like maybe like a little bit of like identification with the aggressor, and there's probably some relationship to like the trans stuff. That's why I think there's like a lot of overlap with like the, some of the queer trans stuff and some of this Groyper stuff.
You've mentioned with, I think, Nick Fuentes and Andrew Tate about like this connection to queer theory and the trans thing. Could you flesh that out for me? I don't think I understand it.
Yeah, so like if you think about like queer as being fundamentally against like norms and normativity, and so it's that like practice of subversion in a really I think like queer kind of way. And so like I'm not like super familiar with Andrew Tate. I've seen like a handful of clips of both him and Nick Fuentes, but every so often you see like these weird like maybe pedophilia jokes, maybe like gay jokes, like things that are like really outside of the boundaries. And I think there's like a particular phrase called recruiting on the third rail. It's like going to these third rail topics and making jokes and saying things that like are outside of the bounds of normal, healthy conversation. And in doing so, kind of luring people like, oh, well, no one else will say that. So he's saying it. Therefore, we're going to like go with him. But like a lot of it is done in this kind of like joking, irreverent, detached kind of way. Like I'll see if I can find some of these clips and I'll share them with you. But like that's kind of what I mean.
Yeah, I think some of it goes back to that like online trolling type of mentality. Like, Myron Gaines, I think, wore a shirt with a Holocaust joke on it. It's just like, just to be edgy. It's like, I feel like there's something about like that queering discourses and just like pushing the boundaries. There's something connection there. I think you've made that connection better than I have.
Yeah, and that's really because there's that like strategic ambiguity built into the irony. So you can say, oh, it's just a joke, oh, I'm just kidding, but you're also like being serious at the same time. So I think there's strategic value there.
Interesting. So I guess a question of origins. I know, like, to a lot of people, it felt like wokeness just exploded onto the scene in 2014 or 2020, or whenever you first really noticed it. But like to us, it was kind of brewing as like disaffected Marxists in academia for decades before it actually hit the surface. How would you like compare the rise or the origins of the woke right in a similar way?
Yeah, so this is probably not something I'm super familiar with. I suspect that there's some foreign influence. I think a lot of it's probably related to social media specifically. I think there's been capture and subversion of like maybe like right-wing like think tanks and institutions in that sense. But yeah, I actually like I don't know the like specific historical like pragmatic origins.
How much do you see as like this is a woke right as a response to woke left?
I think it's significant. Yeah. I think that that's by design. So, you know, your target's action or your target's reaction is your real action, like getting the right to react in this particular way, adopt the same, you know, entitlement and alienation woke thinking complex, you know, like literally do the things to create the systems of power that will then just like be immediately captured and subverted by the left. I think all of that is by design. But yeah, like I think like because we've been talking so much about this like manosphere thing, I don't think it's a coincidence that the manosphere has been such a hotbed, if you will, for these kinds of things, because a huge part of getting the woke left into American society is through feminism. So I like I don't think that that's by accident, but there's, you know, like you're an adult, you have to take some like disciplined control of yourself and not just react to what like feminists are provoking.
Hmm. That's interesting. I mean, speaking as a white man, I think just for spending years in college classrooms and mental health settings and places like that, and feeling like it's just like a constant wagging a finger in your face and telling you that your opinion doesn't count because you're a privileged oppressor. I think there's like a tendency in me to want to strike back that I have to push down. Like that's vengeance, that's not justice. But I can understand how that desire for vengeance is a very natural response to what has been like a society-wide thing for quite a while.
Yeah, and I think that's really fair and important that there is a natural urge, and that like you're going to have those feelings, but like you said that you actively monitor and try to deal with them. You don't just like let your feelings overtake and control you, and I think that's a very critical difference here.
So, up until very recently, I would have told you that the far left and the far right, or the woke left and the woke right, are equally nasty, but the woke left is more dangerous because they have more cultural and institutional power. And I think that's probably still true if you look at like academia and Hollywood and just a lot of a lot of the structures of our society. But I think that the left is like rapidly discrediting themselves, and we're looking at a shift in real time, a shift from left to right in terms of like cultural power. And I think that is making me reevaluate how much emphasis I put on the woke right. I don't know if that makes any sense, but how do you judge the relative threat from each of those?
I mean, it's like in terms of proportion, I think there's a larger woke proportion on the left than there is the right. So I think the right is by and large mostly just normal conservatives and then a much
Mhm.
smaller faction. Whereas I'd say like the Democratic Party's been thoroughly overtaken.
Mm.
I think maybe they just had longer you know, a longer time of subversion and therefore they're deeper down the line, which by the way, like if the right wants to not look like the left right now, then you probably want to address this like, you know, faction within us. But anyway, so I think that there's like a significant difference in that. I think that the woke left tends to have more maybe like feminine characteristics in the sense of being more indirect, more like subversive in certain ways. Whereas like maybe the right is a little bit more like they just kind of say it, people in place, meaning blood and soil, just like outright just kind of it's there. They do a lot of like some of the queer stuff, which is like very um over the line, if you will. So I think that that difference makes it easier for the right to monitor and notice. It goes less unnoticed because it's a little bit more obvious. Um, and like, like I think both are like pretty toxic, but I don't know if it's a result of just like maybe seeing what they've done like specifically to James. But the woke right seems like particularly vicious to me, like in a way that's very distinct. And I think that might be um maybe like a demographic thing. Maybe it's like they have less time to accomplish their goals and so they're like being a little bit more forward. But I do think there are like relevant differences there. In terms of like actual power, I mean, I think there's definitely woke right in the Trump administration. They've definitely like are not powerful. I wouldn't necessarily put them at the extent of like a total ideological institutional capture, but they've definitely got themselves in the ears of important people and important contexts.
Mm. Yeah, it's. I think to kind of build off of that point, I think we might have talked about this before, kind of the flip side of this, but we are taught from a very young age to fear fascism, to be on the lookout and be alert for white supremacy and anti-woman sexism. And you're like taught. I just watched my like 30th Nazi documentary on Hitler. It's called Evil on Trial. Very good. But like there's so many of those that we're just primed to see that. And I think when like the woke right tries to rear its head, it's like, no, I've seen this in like 30 different textbooks and 25 documentaries. I know what you are, and I'm like not going to fall for that. But it's harder to pick up and analyze and spot like the communist or Marxist ideology, because it's kind of like feminine and more vague, like you were saying. I think that's one thing that gives us an advantage on looking at the woke right, is like a lot of times they're really obvious, where it's like harder to spot on the left. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think there's a level of like self-destruction on the right that's more
Mm.
intense. Again, like I maybe we at some point we can do a podcast with the guy that's a psychoanalyst, because like I think all of this has relevance there. But yeah, there's like a lot more of like some sort of like crash and burn impulse on the woke right that I think is like prevalent in a very specific way that's a little bit different. I think the woke left tend to be a little bit more disciplined, tend to be a little bit more
Mm.
intellectual. For whatever reason that is, I'm not sure, but I think that those differences make it maybe a little bit easier. But at the same time, we do have a problem with the woke right, and we are seeing, basically like strategic communism and like strategic like socialism basically um embedded on the right and pretending and like play acting as Christian and right wing and all those kinds of things. And so there has to be something that's working there, because it has successfully infiltrated and taken advantage of maybe the cultural circumstances or like that built up of resentment.
Mm. I think one of the differences between the intellectual gap between the woke left and the woke right is the woke left was born and developed in academia, and the woke right was born on like 4chan. Those are just very different breeding grounds.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. That might also explain too why it's maybe a little bit more over the top. Yeah, because it's like not even like including the intellectual part of it, but also just like the using irony as more of the strategic ambiguity instead of maybe
Mm.
language.
Mm. Yeah. That's interesting. I think I remember like Angela Nagel, I talked about her a second ago, talking about like the trouble with 4chan is you had like a lot of people who would like post swastikas and like Heil Hitler just to troll and like for the lulz, and like all just like try to upset people, but they didn't actually mean it. But then like a lot of actual Nazis kind of infiltrated 4chan, and it's like, how do you tell the difference between someone who's just trolling and someone who's an actual Nazi when they're saying the same things?
Yeah, exactly. And I think like we should be taking this extremely seriously. Like I know that I've kind of been emphasizing that they're using irony and they're a little bit queer, but that's strategic and it's scary. Like I truly worry, because there's a convergence on both the left and the right of anti-Zionism and like explicitly Jew hatred, and I think it's very very scary. So I think we should be taking that as seriously as it is.
I guess that's probably a topic that I just did a panel with a few different of my Jewish guests about the rise of anti-Semitism, but I feel like that's a topic worth touching on its own, because you've seen the rise of anti-Semitism on the left and the right, and that's kind of odd how they've coalesced. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the theoretical level, like Jews and Judaism in general as like a religion tends to be a little bit more realist, and so it interferes with some of these idealist, political programs that they have. Jews are also significantly more likely to just say no, like they, stay within their existing group and say, no, we're not doing that. We're not going along with the program. And like that, interferes with things. So I think that there's probably some like theoretical and even maybe like theological underpinnings to some of the Jew hatred. There's like like an um, unchanging, solid connection with God, a transcendent God, which is, not conducive to, as I've said, immanentizing the eschaton. Like it's very, it interferes with that in a very specific way. And I'm sure there's plenty of people who've done like research on anti-Semitism who have probably spoken as why like Jews tend to be the canary in the coal mine for a lot of catastrophe, and why, over and over again. And it's, like, and this is unfortunately like one of those things that they use as like an example of why that Jews are a problem, is that they use historic anti-Semitism as evidence of that there must be something wrong with this group, and therefore like we're correct in our anti-Semitic hatred.
One of the most bizarre phenomenon that this isn't like mainstream by any sense yet, but did you know that Hitler was actually the good guy of World War II? Like I had a, I'm not gonna say who it was, but it's someone in my life, just not super political guy, the kind of guy who spends a lot of time on Instagram, just comes and goes, "Hey, do you know that the first person to pass animal cruelty laws was Hitler?" Makes you think, doesn't it? I've heard like that type of thing a lot. It's just like, okay, something is infiltrating the public consciousness, and I can't quite put my finger on it, but like the Jews seem to be at the center of the hatred here.
Yeah, and it's that historical revisionism. It's like the 1619 project, but for Jews. But and it's scary because people really are, and it's like such a like I get a little bit upset about this. Like it's such a smack in the face to all of the people, like all of the American patriots who fought and died in World War II, to turn around and complain about the post-World War II liberal order and, blame everything on the Jews and say Hitler might have been not so bad. Like it's such a level of disrespect to your, these people supposedly care about their ancestors and care about the nation. It's such a disrespect to the people that fought and died and sacrificed that like I find it just like so deeply upsetting and egregious.
I'm wondering if you can touch a little bit on that post World War II, like post war consensus. Because I mean, when I was a lefty, I was reading tons of Noam Chomsky talking about the neoliberal Washington consensus and all that. That used to be a lefty, and now it's like a right wing idea, like the post war consensus. That's like the big boogeyman that the boomers gave us.
Yeah, and like it. And I think we talked about this a little bit with James, the boomer thing, where it's like a little bit
Yeah,
of like the four olds kind of thing,
yeah,
like attack
yeah.
your, yeah. But like that's one of their, I think, like I guess you could call it like a thought terminating cliche,
Yeah.
where the post World War II liberal order is what's prevented, like it's what brought about globalism and is what's, internationalism, the international global market, that kind
Mm.
of thing, which like we've had a tremendous amount of prosperity after World War II. Um, but it's like those things that are basically used as the thought terminating cliche of why you have been alienated from your magical rightful inheritance, that kind of thing. I if I recall correctly, the Marcus Carlson American Reformer thing touches on this a lot. I think it's on like specifically the quote liberal consensus. So I think there's probably a lot to look in on that, like specifically on this topic.
It's so fascinating. It's yeah, again, that's kind of an inversion, the revisionist history. It's and it's so interesting, like because for so long, like free trade and like this pro business mentality, that was like the heart of like Republican right wing mentality. It's all become inverted. I don't understand it.
Yeah, and they use the same like atomized individuals and being a wage slave, and
Yes.
there's like a bunch of thought terminating cliches that are evading me right now, but it's that same thing. And it's like it's a complete straw man, the idea that the lack of national socialism is what's, like like the post World War II liberal consensus and free market is like basically turning you into like an atomized, disconnected, no community, no connection to other people. Everything's about you, and National Socialism is the solution to that. Like that's the framework. And it's obviously like a complete straw man. Also, no one is preventing you. If you want to go do things in your community, you can go do them. Like this is what, it's that entitlement complex. It's if you want to do something, if you want to improve your community, that's on you. Like, it's this kind of expectation that you receive your values and your connections from the top down, just kind of handed to you from your culture and your context, instead of having some sense of responsibility over your own life and being able to make free decisions.
This is similar, like on the like gender red pill type thing. Like the collapse of Western civilization is due to the fact that there's no male exclusive spaces anymore. Have you heard that one? And it's like,
Um,
I'm sorry they got rid of your like male only cigar bar. Like I know guys who just like a couple of dudes smoke cigars together, but like I don't think that's it, man. I don't think you can blame everything on that.
yeah, it's and of course like it's the feminists who did it, and who's
Yeah.
behind the feminists? Oh, it's the Jews. Like it's
Yeah.
it's that logic.
Yeah.
It's very toxic.
Yeah. It's like it's it's just so simplistic. Like once you start hearing the same answer to everything over and over again, okay, yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um so I guess a couple questions left. One is, what's a solution? What do we do about this? How do we fight or overcome or dismantle the woke right?
Uh so like call it out if you see it. Don't I'd say like limit engagement in terms of like trying to argue with them or debate them or that kind of thing. Just shed light on it. And like frankly don't uh like give an inch to the darkness, because I think it's so tempting, especially like in political context. And we didn't really get into like Carl Schmitt and like this no enemies to the right kind of thing, and like this
Mm,
impulse for the unbound executive and stuff like that. But that no enemies to the right is a huge problem, because it's exactly what happened on the left, and now we see what happened to like the Democratic Party is like no enemies to the left, and now you have radicals completely overtaking your party. Um and so it's that same like, don't just because somebody is like an ally in your political thing, um that's not a good reason to give an inch to evil, because that's what's happening here is it's like letting evil overtake you even a little bit, it'll take over everything. Like it's one of those things that you like seriously have to guard. um and like related to that is guarding your own heart, because I think resentment, bitterness, that feeling of alienation, all those are part of being human. And so that's why it's so easy to kind of like prey on that. And if you're, a young person, if you spend any time watching the news, looking at social media, like you're going to be subjected to agitprop, and you need to be mindful of that. So when you feel like you're being pulled in certain ways, or you feel that like sense of bitterness and resentment like kind of forming in your heart, like you need to monitor and address that.
that is really good. That's really interesting. Um, mm. I wanted to touch a little bit on that no enemies to the right thing, because I feel like that's worth fleshing out on its own, because there's like the mentality is it's like if we're in war and the enemy is shooting at us, like you don't want to, picket your comrade to your right because he said a curse word. It's like that's not that big of a deal. Let's focus on the real enemy here. And I think when you start adopting that mentality, like you say, you welcome a lot of evil, and you're tolerating and overlooking a lot of evil.
Yeah, well, and like what you're describing is part of the core justification for no enemies to the right, which is this belief that politics basically boils down to a dialectical, like existential struggle between two opposing parties. And so politics is like fundamentally about existential survival. And so it's like a really, I think, dark and extreme kind of view. Like, obviously that's not the nature of politics. And it, like, it's this belief that everything boils down to two things: beauty and ugly, or this and that. And so it's that belief that everything boils down to two groups, and therefore you're justified in, you know, like basically having fellowship with darkness. And, in doing so, it will really, really destroy both you and your cause.
Yeah, 100% agree. So I've asked you this question a few times, but I feel like you're a person who has a really good finger on the pulse of what's going on in this country. So I want to ask it again. When you look at society more broadly, what is one issue that we're not talking about enough that we should be talking about more?
Yeah. So, like, I never prepare for this question, even though I always know that I'm going to get it. But I think maybe this is not so much like society broadly. Well, like woke right is on the collapse. It's probably on the down slope. So
Oh, right.
I mean, I think because they're very self-destructive. It's probably you just don't want to be taken down with it. So like your
Yeah.
organization or you as a person, like once that ship goes down and you're still on it, it's gonna suck, and there's probably not gonna be like a lot of ways of coming back. So like it's never too late to break out and repent. But I also think like in terms of maybe more specifically therapy, it's like we need to be thinking about and monitoring this impulse in therapy. Because I do think the complete capture of our institutions through like the Marxist capture of our institutions is naturally provoking a right-wing reaction that we need to be monitoring and careful of, because like we're just as vulnerable to this kind of like alienation and um like resentment, identity politics impulse. And I think like a lot of like mainstream theories that are in therapy, like existentialism. This is a difficult word for me to say, but existentialism, like specifically this like Heideggerian stuff, all of that is already kind of embedded in all of this. So like we want to be really, really careful about monitoring the impulse towards identity politics and kind of responding to evil with evil, because it's just not, a good idea.
Love that answer. And I love this conversation. Always fascinating to talk to you, Katie. Thank you for coming by.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out my book, The Woke Mind, The Twisted Psychology of the Social Justice Movement, available on Amazon.